Okay. Now that you are entering your data, once your data are entered, you're going to want to generate a species accumulation curve. And a species accumulation curve is an X and Y plot of numbers of samples. So these are your breeding bird surveys 1 through 30 on an X-axis. And on the Y-axis, you're going to be plotting the numbers of new species you observe in each survey. So to make one of those graphs, there's a really good example and the explanation of them in the General Methods for Field Ecology chapter that I posted on Canvas. But to do that, you're going to want to get some basic information from your data set. So one thing you can do, if you want to get totals in Excel, you can use functions in Excel to do this kind of information. So for example, I want to know how many individual birds were observed in each survey. I created a row down here that says total individuals. And I can use a function to do that. There is actually up at the upper right corner of the home page of Excel a function called AutoSum that you can use. You can also use for a larger set of functions. You can use this icon right in this function toolbar right above where your data are, the F sub X. You can actually insert a function, and you can actually look for your function by typing it in. And here we are, sum comes up. So if I hit sum, it will prompt me to select a range of cells that I want to add together. And I highlight that range in Excel. And I did that by clicking this icon by the cell references. And so these numbers, these letter number combinations are cell references. And so what this formula is saying, I'm asking Excel to add this range of data, which is cell B, this is row, column B, row 3, B3 through column B, row 18, the last species. And you can enter that, or you can hit that icon, that little spreadsheet icon, and highlight the range of data that you want to add. And click OK. And you get a summary. Now I'm getting two like number signs here, and that's because my rows are made too narrow right here. Oopsies, and it's also actually asking me for a certain value. Oh, because I did this function twice. So if I do it just once, it will sum up the numbers of individuals that I observed. So I'm going to do that again. I'm going to erase this function. And I'm going to type into the cell where I want the sum to appear. I hit the F sub X function sign. I select sum. And then I'm going to select the range of cells that I want to add together. And then I click OK. Now, you'll see if I look in the cell where I wanted that summary to happen, a number 14, it shows up. And it's actually giving me a little warning sign saying, the formula in this cell refers to a range that has additional numbers. And it's just warning me, hey, don't you want to count the number 1 up here? And so I'm going to start calling these 0.1, 0.2. So your spreadsheet will show up like that. But this is our summary. And so, but when you look actually up in this toolbar up above, it actually is showing you what the formula is. And so if you were to say copy this cell and paste it somewhere else in your worksheet, you would get a different number, because what you're actually pasting is a formula. And it's a formula with what they call cell referencing. And so by pasting that cell over to here, Excel has made some assumptions. Okay, it thinks that I want to paste the same formula into this column of data. And so it is trying to summarize or tally up all the numbers in column M, starting with row 3, through column M, ending in row 18. So that's the same sort of, it's just transferred the range of cells over to be the matching column to where my bottom cell, where I want the output to be. So it's telling me it's 0, and that is correct if I'm trying to paste the formula. That can be confusing sometimes, but it can also be really useful. So once I have entered a function, say I want to run a function across a large set of samples, I can actually drag that cell across, and it will calculate some functions using the same cell referencing. And so I always double check once I've dragged a formula for the first time to make sure, okay, so this total here is the sum of column C, correct, starting with row 3, that's what it's telling me, to column C ending with row 18, yes. And as you move your formula across, you can see it also transfers that formula over to the matching set range of rows and columns. So that's really useful. That's how you summarize, how you can get tallies or totals. To get total species, I just count them. And this is where the practice that I mentioned of just starting to type your observations in from the first one in your first survey, and then just adding them on when you're first entering the data for the breeding bird survey is generally a pretty neat practice to do because it helps you to make these tallies. And so, for example, for my first range of data, I can really just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There were 8 species. I had more individuals than that, but there were 8 species detected. Another useful thing you can do is you can actually highlight that range of cells, and as you're highlighting it, you'll see in the upper left corner, it's showing you how many rows you're highlighting. And so if it's a continuous range of data, you can get your totals of species that way. I see that I've highlighted 8 rows, and that's 8 species. You can also use a count function. And so I'll show you how to use a count function in just a second. Okay, so let's use the count function to tally up our numbers of species. So I have total numbers of individuals in this row. We just used a sum function here. We can now use what we call a count function. This is different than the sum function in that it's going to count, a count function will count up the total numbers of cells with numbers in them. And so it's just going to tell me how many cells in my range of data have some kind of number. It doesn't add those numbers together or anything. And so to do a count function, I'm going to go up to this f sub x, and I'm going to type in count. And there's a number of different kinds of count functions. They can be really useful, and you use them in different situations. I'm going to introduce you to the basic count function here. So I select count, and then OK. And then I select the range of data where I want to do a count. And it's going to be the same exact range of data, which is, I'm going to highlight. I always like to highlight it because I like to see visually where my data stops and starts. And so I hit that spreadsheet icon, and I just drag down my range of data. Now, something you might have caught if you go back is that the default selection included a broader range of numbers because it was also including that sum of the summary, the total sum of the numbers of individuals. So you really need to check what Excel is by default selecting and correct it. So I'm selecting the same range, B3 through B18. I want Excel to count the number of cells that have numbers in them. And I click OK. And there are 8, and I can double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes. So you can use that count function to count the numbers of species that you detect in any one survey. Now here is the tricky thing, is new species, okay? So each survey, you may or may not be adding some new species that you haven't observed in any previous surveys, and you need that information to generate a species accumulation plot. And so for our first survey, it's very easy because it's the same number of birds that you observe, species that you observe. So there were 8 new species. It was my very first survey. However, if I go and look at my second survey, I see, I saw American goldfinch. That was not a new one because I'd seen it in the first survey. There are actually quite a few species that I observed in both survey 1 and survey 2. But then I have 1, 2, 3 that I only observed in survey 2 and not in survey 1. And so I add that in as 3. If you organize your data by just typing in a list for every new point that you add and adding new species with each survey, your data is going to look kind of like you're seeing here, with anything that's new that wasn't in a previous survey is going to show up below the other numbers. Okay, and so by doing that, it makes it easy to either use a count function or just to count up the numbers of new species that you observe. And so here it was, I could do a count function. I could select count, and I could then just highlight the range of data that represents the starting point for new species that I didn't observe in the previous survey. And you can do that for each subsequent survey if you want. And so you can't drag these count functions because you're going to be using different cell referencing, but you can use them if you have really large data sets. For the data sets we're going to get from this region, it's probably also just as easy to count them up, but you just want to make sure you're not making errors. The nice thing about these functions is if you're selecting the correct range of cell data, it won't make addition errors or counting errors like we can make. So in some surveys, like you can see in survey 4, no new species were observed, okay? And you can actually see that visually in the data set. There's nothing that goes below the last number from survey 3. But actually in survey 5, I do add some more species. And so I'm going to go ahead. I just entered my data for survey 5. I'm going to drag that function across. I can also drag the count function across, but I can't drag the count function here. But I can say, let's count, and I can look at the last survey where there was something new, and I just highlight the cells below that, okay? It was also easy just to tally up 1, 2. But you can use those count functions that way. So you continue to keep track each survey of the new species that you add. And then this is sort of like, it's a similar thing that you're doing, but the final type of data you need to generate a species accumulation plot is the numbers of cumulative species added. And so here we're saying, okay, I have 8 new species the first survey, and then I added 3 the second survey, and then I added 3 more the third survey, didn't add any the fourth survey, and I added 2. And so you're basically just adding these numbers. And so here I'm adding 8 and 3 to get 11. And then here I'm adding 11 and 3 to get 14. And here I'm adding 14 and 0 to get 14. And here I'd be adding 14 and 2 to get 16. So you can do that manually. It's quite simple. You could also enter a function, and it would be equals the previous cell, the cell to the left of your cell, plus the cell right above your cell. And I'm going to delete this range of data so you can see that I can then drag this function across. And you can do it that way too. Again, to avoid any kind of math errors. If you're dealing with small numbers of species, it's unlikely you'll make that kind of error. But if you're adding, if it starts to get to be a large data set, it can be a good way to avoid counting errors. So now you have what you need to make a species accumulation plot. To do that, you need this row of data, and you also need your row of plot, your plot indicator rows. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how to set up your data set to make that plot.